Arcadian Savage isn't the only thing that released this week, and yes, probably the next video is an in-depth discussion on that. We were also recipient to a significant swathe of balance changes across the board to a number of jobs. Some of the adjustments were purely number boosts and were both in dire need and extremely welcome, as was the case for Paladin and Dark Knight, making tank balance much more healthy. Others were alterations to the core flow of the job to go alongside those potency changes, such as in the situation of Samurai, who at long last finally became the Tsubame spamming monster that it was born to be. But there's one job in that list of recipients to changes that I want to discuss in more depth, because, well, I think it's worth having a conversation about. It is Viper. Despite being added in patch 7.0 and being equal parts insanely popular and well received in terms of their gameplay style, Viper has gotten two sets of adjustments already. Firstly in patch 7.01, in which they received additional range to a number of their attacks, including their 4 legacies, Death Rattle and both Twin Fang and Twin Blood Bite. Then, with Savage in 7.05, a whole new series of more sweeping alterations have been implemented. Because the changes are pretty wordy, I'm going to break them down in layman's terms rather than just reading off this huge wall of text. Firstly, Noxious Nash has been removed from the game entirely. This was previously a debuff that you would apply and refresh via either one of your basic combos or Dreadwinder, with plus 20 seconds added to its duration per application for a total of 40. Instead of this, you get a buff called Honed Reavers, which can be used to buff the damage of your other basic combo. For all intents and purposes, it works like Dragon Kick and Boot Shine on Monk. You do combo 1 to get the buff, and then combo 2 to spend the buff, and you'll alternate that forever. In order to make combo names fit more thematically with this new buff, Dread Fangs got renamed to Reaving Fangs. There were also a bunch of potency changes across the board to accommodate the loss of their damage debuff, which ended up being around 2% DPS boost on the whole. Slither also changed and became a little more reactive and fast after you press the button, which I'm sure we could all agree is a positive change, one which tanks were recipient to as well. Now, we get to the reason that I made a video on this. The reason that I wanted to have a discussion about what on the surface seems to be a rather innocuous change. It ties into a recent video I made where I discussed what makes a job fun in this game. To say it outright, I don't like these changes, and I'm disappointed they were made. But why do I not like them? As I've seen incorrectly thrown around dozens of times since the adjustment, the rotation doesn't even change, right? It's exactly the same. What's the problem? Well, that's not true. The rotation does change, and it changes in a way that goes directly against what I consider to be fulfilling job design. If nothing changed, there wouldn't be need for alterations in the first place. It would have been utterly pointless to do so aside from number adjustments. But instead, targeted gameplay aspects have been removed. It's at its core a matter of the number of impactful decisions that you have to make on Viper being reduced, in my opinion. So beforehand, your goal as a Viper wasn't just to keep up Noxious Nash debuff on enemies, but in boss encounters especially, you made it a priority to both keep up that buff and also not overcap it past 40 seconds. This could be surprisingly easy to mess up. Burning a Dreadwinder thoughtlessly could immediately push you past that threshold, or hitting the wrong initial opening to your 1-2-3 combo. Because your 2 personal buffs to damage and speed fully refresh on reapplication, much like those that Samurai has, they somewhat naturally keep themselves up after their initial application, as long as you're hitting something and doing your basic rotation, meaning that the primary thought processes that were behind your Dreadwinder usage outside of your opener were to A, not overcap Dreadwinder cooldowns, but to B, use them at appropriate times in order to gain a full 20 seconds of value of Noxious Nash that would ideally save you a usage of your weaker basic combo. This was an interaction fairly unique to Viper, where you had multiple ways to refresh this one buff, and you wanted to carefully choose which one to place where. And thanks to the 7.05 changes, the impact and reward of Dreadwinder in and of itself is definitely lessened for losing this component in favor of its less interesting buff refreshers. The existence of Noxious Nash also led to decision making as you approached your burst windows. You'd often have multiple stacks of Uncoiled Fury, maybe a Dreadwinder, as well as 2 full Reawakening windows that you need to dump, with the aim of getting it all in a potion and as much of it as possible in buffs, and those precious Noxious Nash seconds tick down quicker than you'd expect. If you want to dump everything, you need to do a quick refresh at some point partway through. It's not a hard thing to do by any means, but I kind of like that there was at least some level of associated management of cost to metaphorically straying too close to the sun. What happens now is that as long as you're able to do a Dreadwinder before going into burst, that alone will give you the duration you need to get everything out without a care in the world. There was also the duration itself. So much in Final Fantasy XIV is linked to 30 or 60 second timers rotationally, from your combos to your basic loops on many jobs. So having a key component that you actively manage being on 20 or 40 instead was a nice change of pace. I want more jobs to have unique quirks and rotational timers that make their core flow feel more distinct from one another. In pre-7.05 Viper, before deciding which button to press next at the end of a combo during your filler cycle, you would check your Noxious Nash timer, your Dreadwinder cooldown, and how your gauges are doing. And then you would make a decision on whether you want to refresh Noxious Nash, if so, how you would do it most efficiently, and if not, then you would press glowy buttons. Whereas now, that entire first section is removed. Heck, the difference of choice versus impotently following the preordained railway track is plainly telegraphed in your basic combos themselves. Before, you made a decision on which one to press. There were right and wrong answers, yes, but you were to make that decision yourself. Now the game tells you, lighting the way before even the first hit of a new combo. Do as the system tells you. No need to think. Do I think Viper sucks now? No, absolutely not. Do I think these changes make it suck now? Of course not. But I do believe that the Viper of patch 7.0 is both more interesting and more fulfilling to play correctly than the Viper of 7.05. I do believe that these changes have more of a negative impact than a positive one, and that the job wasn't given enough time to breathe. It just released. It's been available for barely a month at this point, and when the changes occurred, not a single piece of pinnacle endgame content had been released. It had huge numbers of players clamoring to play it, being the single most popular job in the game on Dawntrail launch by a wide margin, even over the new edition Pictomancer, and this was when Picto was by far the strongest job in the entire game, whilst Viper was performing as a relatively middle-of-the-pack melee DPS. It was played, enjoyed, and got vastly positive feedback. Couldn't we have given it a couple of months with high-end content, and then decided whether it needed anything more than number tuning? It feels like this was a knee-jerk change made to cater to a very small percentage that were seemingly displeased. Viper was never difficult as such. Dating back to my first time testing it at the Media Tour before Dawntrail even launched, my summary of the job was that it comprised of numerous simple components that interlinked with one another in fairly interesting ways, and that the high actions per minute pacing on it, combined with juggling those individually simple elements, were where the fun was to be found. It was easy to understand, fun to play, and had a bunch of small decisions for those that wanted to eke out as much as they possibly could from their damage ceiling. What Viper did have, rather than a high level of complexity or difficulty, were the inclusion of failure states. You used to be able to find failure states plastered across most of the game's jobs. Messing up your rotation particularly badly would put you in the naughty corner for a period of time, and you would learn from it quickly. There would be direct feedback to a poorly executed rotation. These still exist to some extent in the game, but the ones that do exist are the bad ones. Black Mage is a good example, with the existence of Astral Fire and Umbral Ice. They aren't difficult to keep up, but dropping them will inhibit you from being able to perform your rotation, and you'll immediately be reminded to not do that again. Viper's Noxious Nash, or rather the act of dropping it, was in my opinion a healthy failure state. Losing that buff in general, but especially during burst or overcapping it, was an indicator of poor play, and gave you as the player a nudge that you can improve here. Now it's not necessary at all. Failure states can be a good thing, because decision making is a good thing, at least for me, because friction is an opportunity to make players feel good about overcoming that challenge. If you drop your buffs or mess up your Noxious, it is a learning experience that will feel like a victory when you surpass it. I consider it to be important because rewarding job gameplay should be about decision making. Rather than purely following that railway track mindlessly, you should have options. Some of them will be right and wrong, some won't matter at all, and some will be not immediately obvious, and you need to delve deeper to figure them out. Many of the most beloved iterations of jobs in this game's history have followed that very ideology. And this would be the part where I'd go on the same old rant about Miasma 2, but instead I've grabbed a few comments from that recent video I mentioned earlier from real players, where they talk about what they feel is important to make a job feel good to play. I agree with them too. There has been increasing levels of chatter as years go by about stagnation in job design, about homogenization, and about a feeling of malaise. I don't necessarily fully agree. I think it is a deeply nuanced topic that would demand a separate discussion. But what I am confident in, without opening a can of worms, is that I think the recent Viper changes act to remove interesting elements without adding much of value in exchange. I'm not a big fan. Whilst the job is still enjoyable, I preferred it the way it was before. I know I'm not alone either. What do you think? Do you like the new Viper adjustments? Are you indifferent? Do you dislike them? I'm curious to hear your thoughts too, because more than anything, I think this is a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.